Bring in Cheryl Fiandaca now, again, our chief investigator, but also a lawyer. Cheryl, thank you for joining us here. You've been watching this very closely. You watched the first trial very closely. What struck you about what you saw today?
We saw some excellent lawyering today. I mean, you have two very seasoned lawyers pleading their case, explaining to the jury why their opinion of the case and their theory of the case is the right theory. I mean, you know, you saw Alan Jackson get up there. He's very different than Hank Brennan. His personality is very big. He's a showman. His arguments were excellent. I mean, he brought out every single point that they wanted to make and tried to explain to the jury why what the prosecution said happened actually didn't happen, and why this big cover-up that started from the very beginning with those text messages from Michael Proctor, the lead investigator in the case, where he basically said, this case is wrapped up. No, the people in the house are not considered anybody that we're looking at. She's going to be charged. She's going to face serious charges. This is at the very beginning of the case, before the investigation had even ended. And those were his proclamations at that point. So he's saying this was all put in place at the very beginning and carried it out all the way through. And then you heard Hank Brennan said, don't get distracted by all of that. Sure, you know, this happened and that happened, but here are the facts. The facts are she was drinking a lot. Here they have all this evidence of the drinking. They have her evidence of the fact that they were not getting along. It was a difficult relationship. They have evidence that she brought him to this house. And then there's nothing more. His phone doesn't move. He says the data shows something different than what the defense says the data shows. And he says that's where she left him. And she was the only one that could have helped him. She was the only one who could have called 911. She was the only one who knew where he was. So you have two very impassioned lawyers making their case, and they were excellent.
Cheryl, stay right here with me if you can. We now have Kristina Rex outside of the courthouse. Of course, she's been following this since day one. And Kristina, I'm going to ask you the same question I just asked Cheryl, and that is, what struck you about what you saw in these two closing arguments?
David, I think what struck me is the match between these two lawyers. It was certainly different than closing arguments last year. Last year you had Alan Jackson get up and give this really impassioned closing argument, and then Adam Lally much more muted. That wasn't the case so much this year. Also, it stuck out to me that Hank Brennan specifically took parts of the defense's closing argument and brought them into the prosecution's closing argument, spending some time trying to dispel the defense's theory of the case, as he was also trying to review all of the Commonwealth's evidence in front of the jury.
And I thought it was interesting, you mentioned sort of the different styles this time around. It was fairly muted, and if you remember last time, the prosecution, in an awkward fashion, didn't even finish their closing argument. You remember the judge saying, you have 5 minutes left, you have 1 minute left. Hank Brennan seemed to have a better sort of hold of what he was trying to argue. Both sides sort of cutting down on the amount of talk about who the other players might be in this case. We saw fewer witnesses coming to the stand that were in that house that night. So it was interesting, Kristina, because a retrial, you sort of ahead of time thought maybe it's going to feel a lot the same as the first time around, but this seemed quite different, didn't it?
No, it was absolutely different. And our legal analyst had warned this was going to be more streamlined, and she was 100% right about that. I do want to point out one thing. You mentioned the time. During the last trial, the judge had set a hard 1 hour deadline, and she had cut off Adam Lally when he was going over at the end of time. This time, she set a deadline for 75 minutes for each side, but she didn't cut anybody off. Alan Jackson spoke for 86 minutes. And Hank Brennan spoke for 80 minutes. So both of them actually went over time, but the judge did let them go on until they actually finished their closing arguments. And you're right, in the defense's closing argument, they did kind of point the finger to Brian Higgins, saying that Michael Proctor should have investigated him as a potential suspect. But that's it. You know, during the last trial, there were several people who they pointed the finger at, but those are now witnesses who didn't even take the stand in this trial. So it certainly was not the same trial. Jurors did not hear the same evidence and heard from far fewer witnesses. By my count, about 30 or so fewer witnesses than they did in the first trial.
And you imagine what a tough job this is for the jurors, because Kristina, as they were giving these closing arguments, basically the defense was saying, you know, the prosecution, their experts, they were terrible. And then the prosecution gets up there and says, the defense experts, they were terrible. So if you're a juror, you're now sitting in this position of trying to figure out, what do I believe, which is really been the problem with this case since day one. There's just so much information to get through. Quickly, as we talk about differences between the first trial and the retrial, you've been outside of the courthouse. Things are a little different this time around, people across the street. Last time we saw the video of people huddled around, iPads and little TVs watching the closing arguments. What was it like there this afternoon?
So it's the same or similar as it was during the first trial now. It hasn't been this whole trial. There's been far fewer people here, but that has all changed today. Actually, take a look right now. It seems like Karen Reed might be coming out of court. We do have a photographer down there trying to get some video. Yep, there Karen Reed is going to the car. So there's going to be a 30-minute lunch break right now. We weren't sure if she was going to have time to leave court, but clearly she did. You can see they're silent right now, but all of the supporters right here across the street, they were cheering when Aidan Carney, a blogger known as Turtle Boy, came out of court a little while ago. But when Karen Reed came out, they were like, shh, 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 and everyone's just filming her as she goes by. But there's got to be 150, well over 150 people out here today. So it does have a similar feel to the first trial. And just to get back to one other thing you mentioned, you were talking about how in closing arguments, both lawyers mentioned each other's experts. Really interesting to me, both lawyers used video from each other's experts to prove part of their case in their closing arguments. Really interesting stuff.
I'm going to ask you to stand by if you can, Kristina. If you need to leave, just let us know. I'm going to bring Cheryl back in because let's talk about the logistics of what happens next. So they have lunch, they come back, and at that point, Cheryl, Judge Canoni will give her instructions to the jurors. And this isn't just like a thing where you say, hey, go in there, try your hardest, and here are the 3 charges. It's much more extensive than that.
Right. I mean, yesterday they spent most of the day talking about what those instructions were going to be, both sides getting to weigh in on what the judge tells the jury. Now, basically, she tells the jury what the law is, what the Commonwealth has to prove, what the elements of the case are, what the defense arguments are, like that Bowden defense that you were talking about. She brings all of that in. It's long, it's tedious, it's kind of information that's hard to understand. And these folks have already been sitting there a really long time. I think they're anxious to get the case and to get back there and to have a conversation about it. But you heard her just moments ago telling them this is not the time for you to talk about it. You have to wait till the instructions.
She said yesterday, arrive early.
Right.
Today, because we want to get this in the jurors' hands pretty early in the afternoon to actually give them some working time on a Friday afternoon rather than giving them the instructions and saying, go home, come back on Monday.
Right.
And so they'll have a little time probably this afternoon.
They should have a little time to deliberate this afternoon. And, it's interesting, this case is, as we know, is very polarizing. I mean, there are a lot of people who believe that she's innocent. There's a lot of people who believe that she did it. So, you're probably going to see a little bit of that dynamic on the jury as well. But we've also heard, as you said, a lot of conflicting information that they have to go through and sort out. And at the end of the day, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a very, very high bar. And I think Alan Jackson made that point repeatedly in his summation, talking about how difficult that standard is to overcome. If you have any doubt, if you have an inkling of doubt, if there's a possibility of doubt, then you have to vote not guilty. So he hammered away at that. And as I said, the prosecution got up there, and Hank Brennan is a very, very good seasoned lawyer who is a defense lawyer, ironically, and, trying the case for the prosecution and basically coming out and saying, don't get distracted by that. Here are the basic facts. Just stay here. Keep it simple.
Yeah. It is interesting. You mentioned Hank Brennan, as we see him on the screen there, defense attorney for Whitey Bulger
at
one point. On the other side, Alan Jackson, defense attorney for Kevin Spacey at one point. We're talking very high-profile lawyers, and regardless of what you believe, both of them really seem to have their act together in these closing arguments. Whether you believe what they say or not, they definitely had sort of well-thought-out arguments. Let's bring Kristina back in now because, Kristina, 12 jurors will be chosen. But right now, we're at 18. So if you can sort of lay out how that's going to happen. How are we going from 18 to 12? I imagine if you are one of the jurors right now and you end up being one of the 6 alternates, maybe that's a relief and maybe that's kind of a bummer for you after putting in all this time.
Yeah, I think it's got to depend on how jurors are feeling, right? Whether or not they want to deliberate. And I will say, it's incredible that all 18 jurors have stuck here from opening statements until now. During the last trial, about 4 jurors dropped out for one reason or another over the course of the trial, so all 18 are still here. So the way that this is going to work, to our knowledge right now, is that the judge will pick the 4-person first, which the judge in Massachusetts has the discretion to either pick the 4-person or to let the jury pick its own 4-person. The last trial, she picked the 4-person in seat number 1. We'll see if she does that again this trial. Right after that, the rest of the numbers, so 17 more numbers, will go into what I can only describe as a bingo box. The clerk will roll that box and pull out the numbers of 6 alternates. And those 6 people then will be sent into a separate room. They will not be in the deliberations room. They're going to be sequestered in a separate room, not allowed to talk about the case. They could be brought in at any point if a juror drops out over the course of deliberations. But I will tell you this morning, the defense filed a motion for a specific way that they wanted jury alternate selection to go. They actually requested to have Karen Reed herself be the person to pull out the alternate numbers. That request was quickly denied by Judge Cannoni, but it will be interesting to see if any of the things they requested happen during the course of alternate selection, or if it goes just like it did during the last trial. Of course, we're going to be streaming as it happens.
One of the great things about the coverage we're going to have here today is Kristina Rex, if you don't know, just graduated from law school. Right. Cheryl is a lawyer as well. And when you hear some of these things, Cheryl, it feels like different parts of a trial, they almost feel like they're for dramatic purposes, that they're theater in some way. I mean, asking if Karen Reed can be the person who pulls the alternates. In every case, there are conspiracy theorists. They won't believe that it's a random process. So maybe that's the defense's way of saying, hey, you know, they had it in for us. So they wouldn't even let Karen pull the numbers, which, have you ever heard of that before?
No,
the defense pulling the alternates?
Never heard of it.
Yeah, right.
No.
All right, so how difficult of a job will this be for the jurors, and what makes it so difficult, do you think?
You know, just the length of the case, the amount of exhibits, all of the video that they saw, the reports that they saw, the witnesses that they have to assess their credibility. Do they believe this person? Do they believe this person more than that person? You know, there's the competing experts. As we heard during the closings, everybody was talking about the other one's expert, and that this is why their expert was wrong, and these are all the things in the test that they didn't do, and this is what this proves. And, you know, these are lay people that are sitting there that have jobs that they're not lawyers. They have to sit there, assess all of this, use their own common sense, which is what the judge is going to tell them to do. You're not a lawyer. Use your own common sense when you evaluate these people and evaluate the evidence. And they are the deciders of the facts. The judge gives them the law, they have to apply the law, but they get to decide what the facts are. And they could go back there and it could be quick and say, you know, we're all in agreement, and they can vote however they wish.
Let's bring in Kristina Rex again, because Kristina, I had a question for you about this jury pool. You've been in the courtroom quite a bit. You were there the first time around as well. One of the things, of course, we never see on camera is how the jury is reacting to different testimonies. So give us a sense, if you can, first of all, why the jury pool is different this time around and in what way. And then if you can, what struck you about watching them and their reaction throughout the case?
Okay, so a lot of thoughts on this. First of all, the jury is much younger than it was during the first trial. By my estimate, I would say the majority of jurors are under 45, based on just looking at them. Of course, I don't know anybody's ages, but it's a much younger jury. There's one man on the jury who, by my guess, is in his early 20s. It's also more racially diverse than the first trial's jury. We're not allowed in the media to give very specific descriptions of these jurors, so I'm just being careful about how I'm describing that. But there are more people of color on this jury than there were during the last trial's jury. So that's kind of the demographics. They're also split 9 and 9, men and women, so perfectly even gender split on this jury. Over the course of the trial, I think they've been kind of hard to read. There's a lot of avid note takers, and they appear to be listening really diligently. There was one point where 2 jurors had to switch seats. We don't really know why that happened. And there was another point close to that time where the judge instructed the jurors to basically not react to testimony, make sure they don't smirk or chuckle. I hadn't noticed a ton of that before, but then I noticed none of it afterwards. Really very little visible facial reactions to testimony. I will say you could see a little bit more during closing arguments, and that's because the judge instructed jurors to actually put their notebooks away. The reason being, closing arguments, while they are very important, are not evidence in this case. So they're not allowed to have their notebooks open taking notes during closings. Instead, they all had to put them away, put them under their seats, and so you could really see their faces as they were looking at the lawyers. And they were locked in. You could tell by the end of the prosecution's closing, so we're approaching like 2.5 hours of closings at that point. There were a few of the, what I would describe as the younger jurors, who started losing eye contact, kind of looking down, looking around. But up until that moment, they were all laser focused on the attorneys and laser focused on whatever was on the screen at any given moment.
I think it's interesting a lot of times when you see our coverage or you see coverage of the case in general, the reaction is usually from people who are either heavily involved or invested in the case. So you hear very extreme opinions. She did not do it. Somebody else saying she definitely did it. And Cheryl, I think most people are like, I don't know, because all of the information is so conflicting, isn't it?
It is, and that's what happened the last time when we saw the jury was hung. I mean, you know, they went back there and they just had too many conflicts. They were unable to resolve their conflicts. Some people on the jury believed that she was guilty. Some people believed that she was not. They couldn't come to an agreement. The jury has to come to a unanimous agreement on each of the counts here, and there are 3. Like you said, there's like a lot of evidence, and there are very, very definite opinions about this. So they have a tough job. There's no question about it. And jurors, you know, traditionally take their jobs very, very, you know, responsibly. They are serious about this.
Yeah, they take it sort of as an honor to be part of our judicial system. Let's go back to Kristina one more time, because Kristina, I know you're going to have to go back into the courthouse. The judge gave us those instructions, sending them to lunch at about, I think it was about 12:30. So you may be back in the courtroom pretty soon. Just give me, if you can, something I didn't ask you that you think is pretty important to what you saw today.
Well, I just do have a comment on what you were all just talking about. I think that when we look back on a mistrial last time, a lawyer had said to me at one point, not a lawyer in this case, just, you can't get 10 people in a room to agree on this case. So it's going to be really interesting to see if that can happen with jurors. You know, what if there's another mistrial in this case? That's a very real possibility. What if there's another hung jury? The one other thing I'll be looking out for, and I know everybody watching will be looking out for, is what the judge instructs the jury on regarding how to come to a verdict and how to come to a split verdict if that's an option here. Jurors anonymously during the last trial, and what they told me was that it wasn't necessarily the slips that confused them. They get 3 different slips, 1 for each charge. What confused them was that they didn't necessarily understand, A, that they could render a split verdict, or B, that if they told the judge they were deadlocked, that would lead to a mistrial. They didn't know that was the end of the road after a while. And so the judge had said yesterday when she was preparing for today that she feels as though she was crystal clear, and that she noted that she's been upheld in multiple appellate courts, that she was crystal clear in her instructions. However, she said, I will make sure I am crystal clear in my jury instructions. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how she instructs the jury to understand really what its role is to try and avoid another mistrial here.
All right, Kristina Rexett live outside of the courthouse. We're going to let you go so you can get back into the courtroom. Thank you for everything.